Now we have to go back a bit and understand what steam technology was like in 1815. This is the 19th century we're talking about. And, it wasn't really the best. I mean, the technology was still very, very new. And people were still getting their feet wet when it came to the technology and figuring out how it worked and what it was good at and what it wasn't good at and the potential. It was still very, very new territory when it came to science and engineering and everything like that. So understand that the reason why this explosion happened wasn't necessarily due to ineptitude. It was due to ignorance, because they just didn't know what they were dealing with. Safety standards hadn't been established, and more importantly, the limitations of the technology had not yet been established. As we all know, steam engines are built off of a pressure-based system. The power comes from steam pressure. Now, the inherent danger here that has to be rectified is that anything under pressure is capable of just exploding, bursting, whatever you want to call it. There's always that kind of concern. Now, with understood mechanics, you can build a product that won't result in such a catastrophic failure. And in fact, it's important to mention that the steam boiler explosion we're talking about with this particular locomotive was based off of the boiler integrity failing. This is very rare, especially when you get to the 20th century. By that point, the understanding of the limitations of the materials involved when it came to constructing a steam locomotive were well understood. And in fact, steam explosions due to boiler failure were nearly unheard of in that time frame. But that was not so in the early 1800s. Again, back then they didn't know the limitations of what is effectively a container you stick your pressurized steam into. They didn't know what the limits of those materials were. So it was possible to put the pressure just a bit too high and cause a rupture and therefore an explosion. And that is exactly what happened in 1815 in Philadelphia. Now, I keep saying Philadelphia, and I probably should clarify for my American audience. I am not talking about Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I am talking about Philadelphia, County Durham, England, in what is now the UK. So, not the Philadelphia that American audiences would immediately think of. This is a completely different Philadelphia. Over across the Atlantic, with our friends over in the United Kingdom. Hi guys, I know you're listening. We're talking about your Philadelphia and your steam explosion. You had the first one. Congratulations. I don't know if that's really something to brag about, but you did invent the technology, so it kind of makes sense that you would also have the first major mishap with it. So I don't think anyone should come down too hard in the UK. Alright, I'm just saying. I'm just defending my guys over across the seas. I'm looking out for you people. I get mad at British Rail enough, I don't need to make more enemies over there. Now, the locomotive in question was known as Brunton's Mechanical Traveler, which... Okay, I suddenly realized some major context may be required for this particular thing. The Mechanical Traveler was an invention by William Brunton. He was a Scottish engineer and inventor, and it did not operate like any steam locomotive you have probably ever seen in your life. But again, this was early, when the technology was new, and we didn't really know what the heck we were trying to do with it. We were just trying for anything. Brunton's idea here was to quite literally emulate a horse with two mechanical legs that were powered by the steam engine. And I'm gonna give it to him here. It was constructed in 1813, and for him to actually figure out a way for a steam engine to work two mechanical legs, I mean, he basically made a steampunk Metal Gear, alright? You know, it wasn't nearly that big, but you get my point. Like, the mechanical nature of this actually fascinates me. It had to have been a trying effort to get it to work the way it does. And it did function! Like, it did move forward. The legs were the drive, and it moved itself forward on rails, but it could only go about 3 miles per hour. So it was also about as fast as a walking horse, but I guess that's to be expected. It was designed to run on wagonways, which differ from railways slightly. Wagonways were also a set of rails, effectively, but they didn't have ties like we think of when it comes to modern railways. They were kind of built like into the ground or sometimes just on the ground, and they were used to keep the wagons steady while either cables or horses pulled them up from a mine shaft, for example. The Mechanical Traveler was meant to be a mechanized version of that. And I guess if you really want to get technical, it still can be called a railway, but just not the way we would think of them. It's also probably pretty obvious that this particular design never really took off because, well, I think it's obvious. This just wasn't going to work, nearly as effectively as what would become the modern steam engine. Like, the top speed, the power output, the act of mechanizing actual physical legs with steam power, it was way too complicated for its own good and at no gain. But again, early technology, people were trying a whole bunch of stuff, and I gotta commend William Brunton for his creativity here and just making it work at all. Like, honestly, I'd be curious to see a recreation of it, just to see a little steam engine walking with a pair of legs like that. Like, that'd be neat. But you're here for the big boom, the explosion. What happened? Well, in 1815, the Mechanical Traveler was out being tested in Philadelphia, County Durham, England. Now, sources are limited on this because it was such an isolated incident. Normally, steam explosions only affect the crew on board, but in this case, there was a crowd of onlookers around, and at least 13 people were killed. Some sources say it was high as 16, it goes back and forth. The cause of the explosion was due to a boiler rupture. When the pressure gets too high in a boiler, they explode. That's a thing that happens. Now, there are ways to prevent this, but there are also many causes. In the Mechanical Traveler's case, it actually had safety valves installed specifically to prevent this problem. However, apparently those safety valves were actually screwed down too tightly, and this prevented them from going off, resulting in the boiler giving way well before the safety valves warned of the danger. The result is, well, it killed at least 13 people, and completely threw the Mechanical Traveler project out the window. Nobody is willing to rebuild it or even test it further. And to be fair, it never would have amounted to much because, pushing a locomotive around with a pair of legs is not nearly as good as what we know steam engines to be nowadays. So, it was never going to work out, but it's kind of a shame that it had to result in a few people's deaths. But in its defense, it wasn't like the Mechanical Traveler's legs were the reason for the explosion. That had nothing to do with it. It was a safety valve problem. And believe me, there are other steam explosions in the 1800s on more practical style steam locomotives that also suffered similar failures. So it's not like Mechanical Traveler is necessarily unique in that regard. It just is unlucky enough to be the first one. So with that, till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell. The Best Friend of Charleston is one of the earliest locomotives constructed in America. It was delivered in October of 1830, and its first run was December 25th that same year. It was built for the South Carolina Canal and Railroad Company by the West Point Foundry of New York. The Best Friend of Charleston is actually an unofficial name, but it was based off of the fact that it operated in Charleston, South Carolina. It was a 040 locomotive, very, very early design, as I'm sure you can tell. But for its era, it was actually quite good, capable of traveling up to 25 miles per hour, or 40 kilometers per hour, and in those days, that might as well have been light speed. The locomotive was warmly received by the area. People were enjoying the new technology and the new availability of speedy public transit. It was something that was revolutionary for the time, and the Best Friend of Charleston was just one of many locomotives that were showing people what the new advent of steam power could provide for the future. But unfortunately, the Best Friend was not long for the world, as an incident on June 17, 1831 would show. As the Best Friend was in operation, the fireman opted to do something terrible, like just the worst thing he could have done. As most of you are probably aware, a steam locomotive usually operates with two people, an engineer or driver and a fireman. And most of them, including the best friend, are equipped with what are called safety valves. Because a steam locomotive is a pressure-based system, the safety valve is a critical component, as not only does it allow excess steam to be released from the boiler, but it will alert the crew that the pressure is building too high and to cool things off a bit. The firemen, apparently not being trained very well, or simply not caring, opted to do, well, one of two things. Sources aren't clear exactly what he did. Some say he simply closed the valve, which you can manually do. You should not, but you can do it. But other accounts actually say he used a flat piece of wood and sat on the safety valve to silence it. Seriously. It's unclear which one he did, but either way, closing the safety valve, especially one that is currently, going off, is actually a really terrible thing to do, because the whole point of the safety valve is to release excess steam. If it's not going out with the safety valve, it will find another way, eventually. And sometimes that way is very cataclysmic, as it was in this case. The best friend exploded, showering debris and hot coals all over the place. The only victim was the fireman, who, to be fair, was the one who chose to silence the safety valve, so yeah, I feel bad that he's dead, but also he kind of asked for it. The engineer, Nicholas Darrell, was actually unharmed. This was likely for two reasons. A, the best friend of Charleston's design, as you can see, has the driver on the opposite end of the locomotive compared to the fireman. But additionally, and probably primarily because he still would have been close enough to be hurt, the reason he was uninjured is that at that time, there weren't conductors to handle the cars, passengers, and switches. It was actually the driver's responsibility to do all that, and at the time of the explosion, Nicholas wasn't even on the locomotive, which is mostly why he escaped unharmed. However, in the advent of the best friend's destruction, the railroad opted to make it a rule that the engineers have to stay with the locomotive at all times while it's in operation. Had Nicholas been on the locomotive, he probably would have seen the firemen do something cripplingly stupid and be able to be like, hey, wow, don't actually do that. The best friend was salvaged, and its parts were used to build another locomotive, the Phoenix, a very appropriate name, all things considered, and that was in operation until at least the Civil War. Despite what happened, the best friend is relevant as arguably the first successful revenue service locomotives in America. The TomTom was never used for that purpose, as it was only built as a demonstrator, whereas the best friend not only was built for the purpose, but served it, and it would have kept doing it had it not been for that fireman. There's a couple replicas of the best friend, one of which is operable, and it was constructed in 1928 to commemorate the centenary of the South Carolina Canal and Railroad. And there's also the Best Friend of Charleston Museum, which opened May of 2014 in the Charleston Historic District. And on one hand, it's kinda nice not to be able to blame a crown chief for a boiler explosion, which I know rarely happens on this channel, but also, do I even have to say don't sit on your safety valve? I feel like I shouldn't have to say that. You guys kidding me? Come on, man! What were you doing? Pennsylvania Railroad 520 is a 282 Mikado-type steam locomotive, which we've talked about before. Mikados were an extremely prevalent type of locomotive, constructed mainly in the early 20th century. And more specifically, 520 is a member of the L1S class. The L1Ss were constructed between 1914 and 1919, mostly by the railroad's own Juniata shops, but some were also constructed by Baldwin. 520 was actually one of those, and a few more were constructed by Lima. 574 of these locomotives were produced, and for their time, they were actually extremely good, easily one of the best out of all Mikados ever produced. And even though they were very successful, it turned out that Pennsylvania Railroad wound up not having that much use for them, at least not at first. Only 2 years after the L1Ss were created, the Pennsy also created the I1Ss, which were 210-0 decapods. These locomotives were a bit larger and had better tractive effort to deal with the railroad's mountain grades and heavy coal trains. Then in 1923, the M1482 Mountains came into being, and they took over high-speed freight runs. So the L1Ss were eclipsed pretty early on, and a significant chunk of them remained in storage throughout the Great Depression, but they were put back into service for World War II. As we've been over many times before, World War II was very much an all-hands-on-deck for pretty much every industry under the sun, and the railroads were one of the major players in that department. Goods needed to get moved around, and not just munitions and supplies for the war effort. Food, materials, everything you could possibly imagine had to get moved around as quickly as possible, and the railroads were the best way to do it back then. The L1S has put in a substantial amount of work in this department, and 520 was no exception. But she was the one to suffer a bit of a cataclysmic major itsy-bitsy. Those words shouldn't string together. It was a problem. It was a bad day. It was November 14th, 1942, and 520 was pulling a freight train from Altoona, Pennsylvania to Conway, Pennsylvania. She had a 4-man crew on board: the engineer, the fireman, a brakeman, as well as a conductor. However, something went wrong. As she was passing near Crescent, PA, her boiler suffered a cataclysmic explosion. The blast hurled bits of metal and red-hot embers all over the place. It had been so powerful that the tender and 6 of the tank cars behind 520 derailed as a result of it. There was also a house nearby, the windows of which had been shattered by the blast. 2 occupants inside the home had been burned by scalding water, and coal embers that had flown through their broken windows had managed to set a rug on fire on top of everything else. Out of the 4-man crew, 2 managed to survive. The fireman and the conductor actually managed to get away with their lives, though they were badly injured. The engineer and the brakeman weren't so lucky. They would die in the blast. And in case any of you are wondering, and I'm sure plenty of you have guessed by now, what caused 520 to explode? History in the Dark, please tell us. It was the crown sheet. What did you think it was? What did you really think it was? Every single time we talk about something in the 20th century when it comes to steam explosions, it's the stupid crown sheet. You knew that, I knew that, but yes, they let the water get too low. When they put water back in, the crown sheet was too hot. The metal caused the water to immediately flash over to steam, which increased the pressure too quickly, and the boiler exploded. Again, keep water in your steam locomotives. As for 520, well, she actually wound up being repaired. See, this has come up a lot when I've talked about steam explosions. Some people wonder why a lot of these locomotives seem to be getting repaired all the time. The reason is actually very simple. It's actually not that difficult to replace a boiler if that's the only major component of a steam locomotive that winds up damaged. The expensive bits of a locomotive are, well, below the boiler, and the wheels and the pistons and all that mechanical madness. But if it's just the boiler, it's actually not that hard to replace it. And that's exactly what they did. 520 returned to service not long after the incident. And I'm sure more than a handful of you have been noticing that a lot of my pictures that I've been using of 520 are actually extraordinarily recent. And that is very easy to explain. She's still around. 520 is the sole survivor of her class. She is the only L1S that survived in the preservation. She remained in official service until October 20th, 1957. She pulled a railfan special out of Baltimore, Maryland, going from Enola to Northumberland, Pennsylvania. After a round trip there, she was retired to the Pennsylvania Railroad's collection of historical locomotives, where she remained until December of 1979. That year, Pennsylvania Railroad successor, Penn Central, wound up donating 520, as well as pretty much every other piece of the railroad's collection of historical locomotives, to the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, who put her on display at the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania, where she still sits on outdoor static display to this day. She was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1979 as well. When it comes to 520 from a personal perspective, I can actually speak from there, as I have been to that museum and have seen her, and she is quite a sight. She's a very impressive locomotive. She's not the largest ever, but not the smallest, and it's certainly impressive that she could suffer such a cataclysmic explosion and not only be rebuilt, but be the only survivor of her class to this day. My only complaint with it is that she's an outdoor display. And I don't know about you guys, but I can't stand outdoor displays with locomotives. I don't like watching these old locomotives sitting outside to rust. Now, to be fair to the Pennsylvania Railroad Museum, they do take very good care of even their outdoor displays, and I do understand they only have so much space inside. But still, it would be nice to see 520 move from her spot and placed under a shelter where she can be enjoyed by museum guests for years to come. She is the only member of her class to survive, and I think she deserves it. Now, maybe some of you outside of the realm of knowing are probably like, what the heck is a Heisler? I will happily explain this. I have brought them up before, but maybe you missed that video. Heislers are one of 3 main types of geared steam locomotives. They were actually the last ones to be patented out of the 3 by Charles L. Heisler in 1892. Their inner workings are a little bit similar to climax locomotives, but the Heislers use 2 cylinders canted inwards at a 45-degree angle, which forms a V-twin arrangement. The power then went into a longitudinal drive shaft at the center of the frame, and that drove the outboard axle on each powered truck through beveled gears. The inboard axle on each truck was then driven from the outboard one by external side rods. It results in a pretty unique-looking locomotive. The reason geared locomotives were even used at all is because their tractive effort was stupid. They were never very fast, but they could pull a lot, and they were very useful for mining, logging, and rural operations in general because of that particular purpose. The Shay is the other type of main geared steam locomotive, and they were the most successful ones. Similarly, a separate patent in 1897 covered a 3-truck locomotive that was similar to Class C Shays. But the Heisler's design did not have a continuous string of line shafting running the length of the engine. The tender truck was actually driven by a line shaft above the shaft driving the main engine trucks, connecting it through spur gears. The Heisler wound up being the fastest of the geared steam locomotives overall. And by fast, I mean not very fast at all, but faster than the others. It did have some advantages over Shays, believe it or not, despite the Shays being way more successful. Since the gearing was inside the frame, it was protected, unlike a Shay, whose gears are out. But the Heisler's drive shaft, which was in the center, gave it limited firebox space, and that caused some designs to have issues with steaming. But other than that, they were actually pretty good, and did see a decent amount of success. 625 Heislers were produced over the years, and 35 are held in preservation. The one that we're talking about today was a Scambia Railway engine number 99. And, well, first of all, what the heck is a Scambia Railway? I never heard of that. Well, you probably haven't. It was a small railway that was operated by the Alger Sullivan Lumber Company, hence why they even had a Heisler. The railway operated in Florida, in what is now present-day Century. 99 was actually purchased by them brand new, and used to haul logs from the logging operations. However, in 1922, well, it suffered a bit of an accident. Geared steam locomotives are still steam locomotives, and still require the same safety, practices as a normal one. As the locomotive was in operation, the boiler, yes, exploded, though I couldn't find any pictures of the aftermath of this. Though it probably looks something like this. The explosion had been caused because of low water, and therefore, yes, you all knew what it was. The crown sheet. Again. Sadly, the fireman was killed, though the engineer miraculously did manage to live, as did 99. It was repaired, which seems to be a running theme. Everyone sees these disasters when it comes to steam locomotives and assumes the locomotives are always scrapped afterwards. But it's not always the case. In fact, more often, they're repaired. The reason for this, as I think I've gone into before, is that most of the expensive bits of a steam locomotive are underneath the boiler. The gearing systems and the wheels and all that stuff. That's expensive. The boiler itself isn't cheap, but getting a new boiler is usually a lot cheaper than getting a new locomotive. If the explosion didn't completely obliterate the entire locomotive, as seems to be the case with this one, then just putting a new boiler on it is going to be a lot less money than replacing the whole thing. The pictures I found of it was actually taken 20 years after the blast, on August 23rd, 1942. Number 99 actually wasn't retired until 1945, and even then still stuck around until at least May of 1957, when it was, inevitably, cut up for scrap. But as I said, there are still plenty of Heislers around, some in working order, such as the 3-truck Heisler at the Cass Scenic Railroad, number 6. And most modern heritage railways take safety very seriously, so I can't imagine such an explosion would happen to a Heisler ever again. It was the morning of March 18th, 1912, in San Antonio, Texas, at the Southern Pacific Railway Yards. The locomotive in question was Galveston, Harrisburg, and San Antonio Railroad's number 704, and she was a 10-wheeler. We've talked about these before. 10-wheelers were an exceedingly popular class in the early 1900s and even until the end of steam. They were big enough to hold most trains, they were small enough to not be super inefficient with their size, they were good, well-rounded steam locomotives, and remain so. But on that day, something went very, very wrong. Now, the Galveston, Harrisburg, and San Antonio Railroad originally started out as the Buffalo Bayou, Brazos, and Colorado Railway, which was a very early railway in America, although it was reincorporated as Galveston, Harrisburg, and San Antonio. By the point of this accident, that line was a part of Southern Pacific, which today is a part of Union Pacific. Railway history! I'm stalling. Now, 704 had been involved in an accident in 1911, and it was still undergoing repairs that had just been completed. The workmen were ordered to warm her up and test her to see if she was ready for regular service again. All the repairs had been conducted, so there was no reason to think that anything horrific could be wrong. And the act of firing a steam locomotive is relatively simple. As long as all the steps are followed, it should have been fine. It was not. It was not fine at all. At 8:55 a.m., a horrific explosion occurred. Despite not being the largest locomotive to explode, this particular explosion was incredibly violent, blowing the locomotive completely apart. The split in the boiler actually happened at the bottom, which bent the walls of the cylinder outward, snapping the wheels off and throwing the boiler and all its components into the air. The pressure wave of the explosion also contained a bunch of different engine components, from pipes, levers, rods, plate, iron, grates. As this occurred in the yards, there were plenty of workmen just going about their jobs when this occurred. Many of their bodies would never be recovered, effectively being vaporized by the blast. The explosion was so strong that it uprooted trees and blasted out windows in the surrounding neighborhoods of San Antonio. Multiple residents reported finding body parts raining out of the sky and onto their properties. Many residents were injured. At least one, Mrs. Gillis, was in her home that was 7 blocks away from the roundhouse when the entire front end of 704 slammed into her roof. The home was destroyed and Mrs. Gillis was killed. As people dug through the wreckage trying to help survivors, 32 people were confirmed to be dead, and at least 50 were injured. Another 10 were missing. Why missing? Well, that's because they were standing so close to the engine that they were effectively obliterated. They were presumed dead, but only listed as missing, as they could not be confirmed to be dead or alive. So what the heck happened? Why was this explosion so violent, and what could have caused it? The engine was idling. They just fired it up. It was not in a position where an explosion should have been even considered, and yet it happened. Well, the actual cause was, yes, a crown sheet failure, which I feel like we talk about a lot here, but for those new to the channel, a crown sheet is part of a locomotive's boiler. The crown sheet needs to be kept wet while the locomotive is under heat, because otherwise it'll get dry, and then hot spots will occur. If the water touches a really hot crown sheet, instant vaporization will occur, resulting in an incredibly fast increase in pressure. If that happens and the locomotive can't contain it, an explosion will happen. The problem with this is that there's no reason why A, the crown sheet should have been dry, B, it should have been under the kind of stress to cause this kind of explosion. We've established before with other steam explosions involving crown sheet failures that more often than not what happens is a human error, where in order to try to get extra pressure out of the locomotive, some engineers and firemen will intentionally run their locomotives at low water, because while it's very risky, it can give the locomotive extra drive. But in this case, the locomotive was standing still. It wasn't pulling anything. It literally wasn't doing anything. So that theory is out. There's no reason why the water should have been low. Early on, it was considered that sabotage may have been possible, but this was ruled out pretty quickly as being very unlikely. Even though Southern Pacific was going through some difficult times, dealing with a labor strike. The vast majority of their experienced engineers, workmen, mechanics, all that, had gone on strike, and they were replaced with strikebreakers. The strikebreakers were mostly from out of town and were completely new to their jobs. Many of them hadn't been trained very well and only had a loose experience when it came to working on a railway. And therefore, 2 things are possible here. When it comes to a mechanical failure, 704 was actually fired up the day before and was deemed to be just fine. So that leads into human error. It's possible that because of the inefficient labor that came with the strikebreakers, somebody didn't set the water pump correctly. That's the only thought anybody has here, and it's the only real logical explanation. If someone didn't fill the water up properly, that perhaps that could have caused it. Then again, the locomotive has safety valves installed, so were they repaired improperly? I mean, it's possible, but then how did it fire up the day before without a problem? What did they do on the 18th that didn't happen on the 17th? This is a pretty violent explosion we're talking about. Someone would have had to have screwed up majorly. And to be honest, we're probably never going to get an answer as to who or what, because, like I said, the locomotive was blown apart. 704 was not rebuilt. She was ripped to shreds. And the person responsible for managing her while the fire-up was started was probably killed in the blast too, possibly one of the 10 men that are simply missing. So we're likely never to get real answers regarding this incident as to what exactly went wrong. There are also some theories that Southern Pacific intentionally let this happen as a way to frame the striking laborers, but nothing conclusive ever came of that, so that's just up to conspiracy theories. Ultimately, what happened here, no matter what the cause was the result of a crown sheet failure, and it was kind of a tragedy. It's one of the worst, if not the worst, locomotive explosions in history. And frankly, the more I talk about this, the more I keep reiterating it. Guys, keep water in your steam boilers. Seriously, this really shouldn't be this hard. And yet, it seems to be that way. Till next time, this is Darkness, and a bid you all a fond farewell.